The first I want to take, because it's from a group, is several women request a brief discussion of the animus. How can we translate what men are saying about the anima into our animus? I think the best thing is not to translate, but to try to experience it directly. And I would say how we experience, I'd rather say how I experienced the animus first. Before knowing that there is such a thing as the animus, I just was sure that I was one person who had all sorts of holy convictions, and which I felt were completely my own, and also all sorts of, in my case, skeptical thoughts about distrustful thoughts about human beings, about reality, about so on, of which I would have also said they are all really my own. And only when I entered analysis, I first recognized the animus in that form that I dreamt about negative men and positive men, and Jung pointed out to me that they personified, so to speak, these parts in me. And then I, for the first time, through these, realizing this, seeing these personifications in the dream, I began to wonder if these different convictions and attitudes I had were really mine, or if I wanted really to identify with them. And furthermore, I noticed that whenever I identified with certain of these attitudes, I got on the nerves of men, not only on Jung's nerves, but any man will do, as long as he's virile, as long as he's not effeminate. Then men automatically bristle. And that made me thoughtful. And then that showed me then the two things together, that generally when I had identified with one of those personifications in my unconscious, who appeared personified in my dreams, then I got on men's nerves. And if you put that all together, then you see that is about empirically what the animus amounts to. That's why Jung says it is absolutely for a woman vitally important to have relationships to the other sex, for men too, to recognize the anima, because it's the simplest way of becoming aware that the men are very friendly towards you and open and has a nice conversation, and suddenly they close up and bristle. And then you must always ask yourself, now what's wrong there? Am I not quite myself in that moment? Now, it can be that one has also an insight or a conviction or an attitude, or one is sure one ought or wants to do something, and the men bristle, and it is not the animus. Because naturally men do not only dislike the animus in a woman, but sometimes also for certain unknown reasons dislike something of her genuine nature. But it is not so frequent, but it can happen. I've often seen when analyzing a woman that sometimes she expressed to her husband her true inner self, her feminine self, and in spite of it, he, having learned psychology, say, oh, you are in the animus, and so on, when it wasn't. So there one can only recur to one's dreams. In such cases, then the dreams confirmed to the woman that she was on the right track, and her husband, for some unknown reasons, was rejecting, out of personal complexes, was rejecting whatever she wanted to do or said or did. But even then, the great danger is that if in such a situation one then gets into the animus, in other way, one gets argumentative and wants to prove one's point and wants to press one's point. And I would say whenever I recognize myself being in the animus, A, when I get on men's nerves, secondly, when I can't let a theme go, when I kind of possessed, when I can't say, well, let's agree to differ, let's drop the discussion, never mind. When I kind of get hooked into having to argue the truth out. That is always a symptom of the being possessed by the animus. Now, you must think also that the animus is describing more the negative aspect of the animus, but the positive aspect is also there, and then it is the invitation from the unconscious to, from time to time, act like a man, which can for a woman be sometimes of very great help. I remember that when I wanted to buy a bit of land and had very little money, I had to give my last money to buy this bit of land. And so after having made the contract and everything ready, I just got the jitters. And I began to imagine I'm not insured. If I now get ill, if I can't earn, then I'm bankrupt, and you know, the whole, as one does in sleepless nights. And in that night, I dreamt that I was standing on the high mountains of the Vallis, on one side of the Vallis Valley, and which is about 200 kilometers broad. And from the other side, from the Mont Blanc side, I saw a black speck coming through the air. And I looked at it and thought, is that a bird? It's rather big for a bird. And then it came closer and closer. And when it came, after about 10 minutes, I began to see that it was a skier. A skier who jumped 200 kilometers over the whole valley. He would have won in Sapporo. And when he came closer, he came through the air and just landed beside me with an elegant Christiania. And I looked at him in admiration and said, oh my God, how do you do that? And there I saw he was a simple peasant boy who grinned at me in a friendly manner and said, quite simple, shut your eyes and jump. Now, you see, I took the hint, and I said to myself, shut your eyes and jump, and just signed the contract, though I was shivering in my boots. Now there, I let the animus be possessing me. I mean, it was an animus act, but I let it possess me because I thought this was a positive figure of me, and he was compensating my feminine tendency to be anxious and afraid. And therefore, I accepted the suggestion. So you see, the animus can give a woman very positive qualities. We mustn't think of the animus as something only negative. It gives one the courage to do things that one's feminine nature trembles to do. But it is again a question, as it was touched this morning, to discern the spirit, who is who, and to have it out with these inner figures and to make up your mind. I made up my mind quite consciously. Now I'm going to follow this peasant boy. Because I felt he was something in me which had this kind of blind courage, and I felt this from looking at the figure in the dream. He was a kind of healthy peasant, and so I said yes to him and incorporated him. That was still animus, but that is the problem with the animus. But we should never be identical. We should always know it is a part within oneself, and then morally decide yes or no, and shall I let it act through me or realize itself through me, or shall I in certain other situations say no, and this is too much? I understood the dream naturally, mainly as a compensation, that I was in this moment in a way negatively too feminine, too dependent, anxious, not courageous enough to take a lonely step. And that's about what I would like to say about this question. We come back to the animus endlessly. You have brought out the terrifying idea that the animus's disintegration over the last 1,000 or 2,000 years has been registered historically in the fairy tales. Apparently in very ancient times, the anima might appear as a mouse or mammal, but latterly it tends to appear as a frog, a cold-blooded animal I can't read that word, de-evolution. It's a kind of de-evolution, a regressive evolution. Do you still see the anima and the anima as developing, or as the turn, or has the turn about begun? I don't think that it is quite so. In fairy tales, you see, I think we all have our saurian tail still hanging behind us. We have evolved, we have the history of the whole evolution in us, just as every little child in the embryo in the mother's womb repeats in sketchy way the whole evolution of mankind. So we have that in our psyche. And but there are progressions and regressions. Now, if in a fairy tale you have an animal which remains right to the end of the story an animal, then it simply means that is a part of our animal nature. That's a part of us which is animal. But if you have in a fairy tale a frog who afterwards tells you that he had been a prince and has been bewitched into a frog by an evil magician and has to be returned to humanity by some loving or other action, then it hints to the fact that this is a factor who had already reached in certain historical times a higher evolution and has been pressed into a regression or has been forced into regression by a cultural bias of some kind, a prejudice, cultural prejudice of some kind. And then whatever we repress doesn't stay the way it is, but if we repress something, it has a strong tendency to devolute, as you would create that word, de-evolute. It evolves backward. But then in the tale it's clearly said, I was once a prince or a princess and have been bewitched. That would mean through the negative repressive effect of a conscious prejudice that casts like a spell onto that inner factor and makes it regressive. And so you have to differentiate in fairy tales who is who and how. I mean, you cannot make a generalization. You have to look at each context. But you can say that if Animus and Anima, we will later have a dream where Animus and Anima appear as snakes, that is nothing regressive in itself. That's just natural. All these inner factors, we as a whole, and also all these inner factors have their long history. They all are amoeba, from the amoeba on, the whole thing. The next one, did Jung research Wicca, nature religion of pre-Christian Europe, white witchcraft much? It carries many of the aspects Jungians work with. Polar integration, nature, source of transforming, multiple images from whether to relate to transform theory, no morality, guilt, pacifying angry gods, etc. As feminine earth-centeredness was all but destroyed by Christian religions. Most speakers at Jung conferences seem to be men, and they address themselves to individuation, holifying processes from the masculine point of view, referring to anima, as do a preponderance of myths, etc., except for some like Amor and Psyche. Would you, from the female side, speak a bit about the anima in animus in woman's individuation personally in Western society to play? I think the second part I have covered at least a bit. The first part, it is true that Jung has not dealt with much specifically with these investigations on the Celtic, Druidic mother cults, and who have apparently survived partly in some white witchcraft traditions. But his viewpoint in general was that that will be the next step to come, because now the feminine principle has been accepted in the deity, in the form of the Virgin Mary, but only in the Virgin Mary has been accepted as a kind of purified, spiritualized form of femininity, in which the Earth Mother is lacking. So the Earth Mother is still not yet in heaven. She has not gone with, and I have seen many dreams of women who, after the declaration of Pope Pius XII, dreamt that now, one Protestant woman, for instance, dreamt she was going to see the Assumptio Maria staged, and she went to a place and the crowds were assembled, and a naked black woman went to heaven, clearly saying that is now what should happen, that the dark woman, the body, the woman, the earthly woman should go to heaven, not a purified form of it. It should be wholly accepted, not only in its disinfected form. And there is a strong tendency in that direction, and that Jung has, if you know his work, pointed out very much that this is now an oncoming process which is going to happen, because archetypes have their own way of thinking, their own conclusions further. I think that the whole fact that so many priests now want to marry is, for instance, though they do it generally for purely personal reasons, they can't stand anymore to repress sex, or God knows what personal problems they have to leave the priesthood, but the fact that it is a mass phenomenon nowadays points rather to the fact, I think, that the unconscious conclusion after the Declaratio Assumptionis Mariae was, well, now there is man and woman in heaven, so the earthly image should be the same. Nobody thinks those conclusions. Those conclusions think themselves. Those are powers in their own right. And I have seen also there's a tremendous increase of the worship of black Madonnas in Europe. And the black Madonnas catch always the projection of the Earth Mother, of the Virgin Mary being more the Earth Mother, the dark feminine side. Generally, our black Madonnas have been places of pilgrimage. Pilgrimage are generally planted above an Isis cult. And you know, Isis was black, was worshipped as a black feminine figure. Black meant before the Christian time not evil, but black meant nocturnal. Nocturnal, unknown, earthly, mysterious. And not what we now, our connotation of black is evil, but that was not so. And the black Madonnas are now coming up. About this witchcraft thing, I know not very much myself, but it goes obviously in the same line. It had effects on the emergence of, I don't know what effects can the emergence of, what effects can the emergence of woman have on the men's or woman's individuation process? Well, for the woman, she has just a better chance, because having more legal freedom and more possibilities to follow her own inner way facilitates her becoming herself. I mean, I could imagine that, and we see it in the biographies of remarkable women of the past who wanted to become a painter or a writer or a dancer, how often they had to terribly fight the narrow prejudices of their parents before being allowed to take on such a career. And these obstacles are slowly removed. So for women, it's a great advantage. For men, it is an incentive. As Jung writes in The Women in Europe, if the women are now developing their masculine side and become more total, we, the men, cannot lag back. We have to pull up our socks and integrate our feminine side, and quick, otherwise the women will catch up with us and go ahead of us. So it has a good effect on men if they take it that way. In your talk, I strongly identified with a woman who had a mercurial disposition, who scatters herself too easily. Do you have any suggestion for dealing with this problem in the midst of a cultural revolution which has so many fascinating things happening at once? I would say that is quite simple. If you ever know how a vine grows, you have to cut certain of the wild shoots to get real good grapes. If you let in a plant too many shoots grow, the sap is distributed and you can't produce anything of real substance. And so that we have to do if we have a mercurial disposition. We have to sit down and say what real matters to me essentially and what is just a momentary stimulating something. And then consciously cut these stimulating, this kind of caffeine effects of certain ideas where one has quite a feeling inwardly they are not really substantial, they are only interesting for the moment. Is the feminist movement a working out of the feminine principle? I would say it should be. Unfortunately, sometimes it is not. It is sometimes, that is really answered by the problem of the animus. The feminine movement, if run by the animus, is destroying femininity. And unfortunately, there is quite a lot of that animus-possessed women lead feminist movement. And by that, destroy the very purpose for which they fight. They destroy their own aim. While if women would do it in their truly feminine way, I think they wouldn't need so much movement. They could just sit and have a tremendous effect by sitting. Sit firm. Could you comment on the image anima in the psychology of woman? How does it function in dream? Either it's a misprint for animus and then its answer, or it is an idea that the anima has an effect, that the man's anima has an effect on women. That is quite true. Fathers have fantasies how their daughters should be. Lovers have fantasies how their bride should be. And if a woman has not a strong feeling of identity, she will very much be tempted to play up to the stage, and then she becomes what we call an anima woman. She plays the role men expect from her and loses her own identity. This is a very widespread and very dangerous thing for women, which generally leads to disaster. You see that in a positive way in Greta Garbo. She was just the anima of thousands of men. She had that certain something which every man was able to project his anima on. But she obviously, in the middle of her life, got a terrible depression and realized that she was losing herself and her own identity by playing the role of the anima and not being herself. That's why she retired so in a depressed and abrupt way completely from the stage and lives now shyly secluded. It has been interpreted as neurotic and so on. I cannot judge that because I don't know enough about her. But the step in itself is very positive. She must have realized that playing the anima is a dangerous game which makes one lose one's own identity. You see the danger already in little children. Mama defends Mama says, I go and brush your teeth and go to bed. And then the little girl says, Papa, will you not play with me? And Papa gets weak, and then she knows how to play that game and put men in her pocket. And so you can see that anima game already in little girls sometimes. And if they do it too much, a little bit of it doesn't matter, but if they do it too much, they lose their identity. Taking the personal view part of your title seriously, would you suggest some of the archetypal images which either Jung the alchemist or you see as images of the one who searches the inner world itself? I don't quite understand the formulation of this question. If it is meant that when those inner images are mirror images of the ego, the searching ego, I would say definitely no. If you, on the other hand, would say if these images are images through which God seeks himself in man, I would say yes. So it depends how it was meant. Would you please comment on any connection you have experienced between the suppression of the feminine values in the West and what appears to be the destruction that we have been engaged in with our great wars, our violence, etc.? This question may be stated too simplistically and perhaps categorically, but I have felt the connection, and I connect this with a continuation of the Beowulf myth. I would say the brutality of the white race, about which all the other races on this planet complain that we are a specifically brutal race, and I think there's a lot of truth in that. The white race has a great danger of being very brutal. I don't think it is as simple as that it comes from the fact of the patriarchal order of it may have rather reinforced or glorified the aggressivity of our race. But you can say the brutality of our race springs more from a lack of differentiation of the anima in men, that men have not differentiated their anima, and if a man has not differentiated his anima, he's liable to terrific outbursts of affect. You know, everything is cold and reasonable, and suddenly, comes the affect. If a man reacts like that, it means his anima is not worked out. In a woman, it's the other way around. If she has not worked out her animus, then, in spite of being feminine and by nature not aggressive, perhaps, she will suddenly turn out an aggressive animus and then be worse than a man, than a brutal man. Women can be incredibly brutal. If you think of the Les Dames de la Halle in the French Revolution, the famous tricoteuses who sat there knitting, looking how all the aristocracy of France was going to be beheaded and enjoying the scene. So I wouldn't put it on either way, but certainly patriarchal ideas glorify more the aggressive brutality in our race, it is one of my hope that through the emergence of the feminine, but by meaning that just as much of the feminine in man than in woman, some of that might be mitigated and changed. Then comes a long dream, and though it's interesting, I think I haven't time to deal with it. It's the dream of the 4 snakes. Perhaps I'll deal with it in the end, and otherwise I ask the dreamer to please ask me privately, but it takes too long. It's a very interesting dream, but it's a complicated one. Now we come to some other questions, general questions, and which will be hopping around a lot. That was all more or less on the feminine problem. Please comment on the conscious fear of death as run in our lack of ability to accept the dying. Thank you. I think that the non-acceptance of our own death and of the experience of the seeing dying people is a neurotic symptom which goes together with the whole neurosis of our civilization. It is a lack of instinct. The only thing which can help us to face death and to face the death of others are the instinctual reactions. I have had, unfortunately, to analyze quite a lot of people who were doomed to die, had a severe cancer, and from the dreams, there was no possibility to accept a miracle healing, and therefore the dreamer and I agreed on that now in about 6 months or a year, this would be the end, and sometimes quite younger people, which is a very tragic thing. And one of the process of individuation goes on in these people exactly as if death would not happen. It just goes on in a rather greater pressure speed. They mature faster. And death is practically in a lot of dreams ignored. I saw only brutal death dreams in cases where the people hadn't yet accepted death and against all hope still hoped, and by that wasted time. Then they had brutal dreams like their watch standing still, their life tree being cut down. Just dreams we say, no, you must face the fact now that that's going to be the end. As soon as people accepted the fact and faced it, then there was no more such dreams, but then on the contrary, one of the most frequent dreams I have seen in dying people, with all the different individual other variations, is that they should trust the animal. That a dog, their horse, their dog, or some animal would lead them through the dark door, which shows that that nature has built in us an instinct. I think the instinct to live and the instinct to die is the same instinct. That same nature which carries us in the right way through life is that same nature which carries us on through the gates of death, and we have to trust it. So it's only if we are clinging to our conscious views and not trusting the depth of our psyche that we are afraid of death. Naturally, the ego likes to live and makes a lot of antics and doesn't go. That also belongs. But deeper down, there is a slow stream which prepares for death, and there are sometimes before death, those people have such incredibly comforting and beautiful dreams that it takes away not the whole tragedy of death, but quite a bit of it. I would like to tell you, for instance, one dream which has stuck in my memory forever. though it was not an experience with a patient of myself, it was a patient, a young woman who got cancer, which finally the metastasis went into the brain, and she was partly delirious, and her analyst, who is a friend of mine, visited her towards the end every day and talked to her, because she still sometimes was there, and he tried to comfort her as well as he could. And the last dream, exactly 24 hours before she died, was that she was standing beside her bed in her nightgown, feeling wonderful. She naturally felt absolutely rotten in this last phase of her dying process. And the doctors came in and said, yes, against all expectations, you are cured. You can now put your clothes on and leave the hospital. And she happily reached out for her clothes and said, I'm cured. And then she looked back and saw in the bed herself lying as a corpse. You see, I think one couldn't say clearer. In one way, you will die, but in another way, that will be your psyche. You go on living, and you will even feel better and good again and be cured and be able to go on. But your body is gone. That is the simplest death dream I have seen, which puts it in a nutshell. But there are many more dreams, and mystical and very strange dreams about death, which, if one attends to them, the process of dying is very much mitigated. And generally, people who are closely struck by the death of somebody they love in their surrounding have also comforting dreams, if they attend them. So I think that we are so terrified of death is partly because we are cut off from nature. Please discuss the potential negative and positive in group therapy. I've done that in a paper which has been published by Quadrant in New York, and I'd like you to refer to that because this is leading very far. To sum up in a few words, group therapy, according to the Jungian standpoint, helps to become aware of one's social identity, what Jung calls persona, to become aware of certain general shadow features like one's power drive, one's aggressivity, and so on, but it doesn't lead further. All the rest is, on the contrary, it very often blurs the self-awareness of the individual. It identifies with collective standards and has greater trouble to find itself. Also groups, as soon as one is in a group, one is very suggestible. So one thinks one is cured, or one thinks one has found oneself, and after one has returned home for a few weeks, it's all gone again. It has only been suggested. Why did Jung have relatively little or nothing helpful to say about homosexuality? I think it's quite simple. Jung wasn't at all a homosexual. Once a homosexual tried to convince him that homosexual love was a higher form of love, and he said, oh, you are quite right, but you see, for me, it's more fun with women. But he didn't believe that women were truly homosexual at all. Lesbianism is really a neurotic mother-daughter problem, which is acted out by women. And when an attractive male appears, they generally drop the game. But in men, he said there are two possibilities. This can be a distortion which has been caused by traumatic experiences, childhood problems, and in that case it has to be treated like any other neurosis and has a chance to be healed. But he thought that there was also a genuine homosexuality in men, that certain men were born genuinely homosexual, that it was meant for them to be so that it would be wrong to want to make them into heterosexuals, that it is a destiny, and that those men generally had some cultural task to fulfill. And in that case, one should not discourage their homosexuality, but just treat them like any other human being, but within that point of reference. He also thought that homosexuality seems to increase in our society, and that might be a trick of nature to spread homosexuality in order to prevent the overpopulation, to keep a certain amount of individuals from breeding. And in that case, it would also have a cultural aspect. which should be. I have myself only met one such a case, but a very clear case of a homosexual psychiatrist who had a lasting, very good friendship with another homosexual relationship with another man, and he had purely theoretically the idea that that was neurotic and he should be heterosexual. And when he came to me, his dreams all confirmed that he was all right the way he was. So I said, well, go home. What do you want? It's okay. And he was very relieved. But then there are the other cases where it's because mother behaved disgustingly and put them off the feminine or so on, and they are, so to speak, not meant to be homosexual, but they are neurotic, and there they need treatment. Would you give some time simply to speak about your experiences of Jung the man? I think that is too difficult for me. I would like to put that aside, if you don't mind. If it comes up in a connotation. I have told you quite a lot about Jung when it comes up in some connotation. Transcendent meditation is not a technique of doing, but rather of allowing yourself to be done by the spontaneous activity of the mind. Take it as it comes. One often experiences a sense of deep relaxation and rejuvenation after practicing this technique. It is as if the conflict and stress works itself out, or begins to each time we stop trying to work it out from our limited ego perspective. Could you comment on any possible correlations or mutual informancy that you see between this type of a technique and analytical psychology? I would say if and when it is practiced in this way, that it simply means to stop this kind of activistic ego worrying and sit back and relax and take what comes, a transcendental meditation mirrors the very, very first step of active imagination. So to speak, the preconditions. But Jung has found that too, and teaches all of us to do that. But from there, but where do you go from here? From there, you have to still a long, long way to go. That is only the first step. But that first step, if it's acted out in this way, as it's described here, is the beginning of what we call active imagination, and is in no contrast, therefore, with Jungian psychology, only that it is the first 10 meters and Jung has gone about 100 more. Please comment on the self. That's too big a question. I might come back on the end if we have time. Since science is physis, the study of nature, and it has become almost the only absolute, could it not be the great Mother Nature, the autonomous archetype manifesting herself? Thus, if science has overthrown male monotheism, the great Mother has reappeared in veiled disguise. Yes, I agree with that, but I think it's formulated a bit optimistically, because science, at least up till the end of the 19th century, is a hybrid or a mongrel between rationalism and materialism. Now, rationalism is the child of scholastic philosophy and therefore purely patriarchal, and materialism is a distorted form of relationship to matter. If I relate to matter properly, I'm not a materialist. Therefore, we could say what really won out was the patriarchal trend, and then the mother archetype revenged itself, but negatively, in the form of invading our culture with materialism, which comes materialism in the gross form of being mad about money, and this quite concrete business and money materialism, too high up this form that we, in our Weltanschauung, cannot conceive of anything we cannot touch. That is, Jung once beautifully called it not concretism, but concretinism. This concretinism is a kind of distorted mother archetype. It is the evil mother. the evil mother, but the mother has become evil because the mother archetype has been rejected, and by that has become evil, and therefore has crept in a negative form in the back door. You see it also in certain dealings in the Vatican, which have become pure materialistic business dealings. There's always this mother aspect in its negative form. So we could say, but in science, the rationalism of the 19th century science is also negative. So we have now a negative father called rationalism or intellectualism, coupled with a negative mother called materialism. And both have, and that is because they turn each other back to back. They would have to turn around, and the father principle of the spirit and the mother principle of matter should be reunited, confront each other and reunited. And then rationalism would become, again, true spirit, and materialism would become a true mystery of reality. And then it's okay again. That's how I see this. How did Jung use anger in his personal life? That's a good one. Anger is given to us like claws and teeth to defend ourselves, and is vitally important. We need rage and anger. But Jung taught us to first control it, learn to control it, and then to use it in a controlled way. That would mean to let it out, but he said to me, let it out, but so that you could stop any minute if you wanted to. And then you need it for self-defense, you need it as a means of self-expression, you need it even in therapy. He once told me, what do I do if a woman comes in and is completely in the animus and gets on my nerves? The psychiatrist in me says, oh, the poor woman, she's now again possessed by the animus. What can I do? The primitive male in me says, oh, beat her over the head. Then he says, I won't do either. But then I'll say to my shadow, now, that was okay. She needs a shock, but let me do it. And then instead of beating her over the head, he utters a disapproving growl, which is not beating her and not accepting, simply all loving acceptance. All loving acceptance is very destructive in therapy because it makes the other person unconscious and infantile. And some people don't, the penny doesn't drop till you growl at them, or if you do this. They just don't listen. If you gently tell them about their faults, they say yes, yes, and nothing happens. So then you have to use controlled anger to give the other. That's why he said, I'm all for electroshock, but it shouldn't be done with apparatuses. I'll give it myself. Because then it remains human. When you do it with an apparatus, then it's inhuman. But if you do it warmly as a human being by just giving a warm animal growl, then it's also a shock, but it's human. So it is a very vital problem, as you see. Would you please comment on the problems of a man's positive mother complex? What can be suggested to deal with this? I would like to make that a bit short and simply say a man's mother complex is, a positive mother complex is an infinite gift of heaven. Look at Goethe. What would Goethe be without his mother? It makes creativity, it makes a man creative, it makes a man naturally liking and loving women, it makes a man artistic, all that. The disadvantage of it is that he becomes soft and easily undisciplined, and that he can't stand hardships, that he can display the mannerism of a spoilt boy. And to help it, it simply means to learn discipline and to not give up when things, to learn to not give up when things become disagreeable, to stick to one's gun, all that, to do a bit more training of independent masculinity. That's what it amounts to get free from the positive mother. Otherwise, the positive mother is like a beautiful cushioned feather bed, and one can become terribly lazy in it. So I would say even that's one of the most outstanding negative features of a positive mother complex is softiness and laziness, friendly laziness. Now comes Irene de Clarimont Castillejo in her book Knowing Woman wrestles with Jung's early statement that if the anima is a soul image of men, males, the animus is a soul image of woman, yes. Man and woman have problems with this. Irene de Clarimont finds in her own dreams and in the other woman's dreams a feminine soul image, often the daughter of an animus figure, that appears after the animus has been befriended, often together with the self. I would be very interested to hear how you see and experience this. I think that is a pure quibbling about words. This feminine figure, which appears after the animus has been befriended, Jung calls the self in woman. And she wants to call it the soul image, but that is a quibbling for words. I mean, you saw this daughter, Monica, in the dream I brought you this morning, who looks like an Indian goddess and so on. I would interpret that as a figure of the self. And Irene wants, for some mysterious reasons, I knew her, I wanted always to call that differently. But I think that I don't see any reasons why one should call it differently. I think it's more, there's another secret hurt behind it, namely the idea men have a soul, but women have only a mind. But that is naturally not true. It only means the soul of woman has more a mind character, and the soul of man has more an eros character. And that the soul of a woman has a mind character because she herself is soul. If the woman is all right with herself, she is the soul. She needs not to have a soul image. She is it. Just as if a man is a real man, he represents the mind. He does not need to have one. He has it. Joseph, the cost signifying inner riches and so on. That's a too complicated question. It's about the bushwoman and the sipwell. I will therefore only bring the end of the question. The positive Jung meant into his inner life, which would come being one must venture into one's own desert and find one's own sipwell, ? Yes, I would say that sums it up. What Jung has shown to us is, you see, the great danger is Jung always went very mad against this false propaganda that we should imitate Christ. Namely, naturally we should imitate Christ, but there are two ways of doing it. Either doing it outwardly, which I would rather call aping Christ, by having the stigmatas and by not marrying and God knows what, just because he did it. Or imitating Christ in a deeper way, which would mean to take that suffering as courageously upon us as he did, and to be that loyal to the inner God experience as he did. That would be the true imitatio Christi. And you can say the same poses itself again on a minor scale in a work like Jung. Shall we imitate Jung and ape Jung and then all is done wrong? Or simply take Jung as a figure whose sight encourages us to do the same thing but in our own way, and where and how we have to do it. I think I'll go on and then do after the break, then the people have time to think the floor question. I think I can still go on. If you are still alive. Would you reflect on the relationship between alchemical patterns of transformation and magical transformations that occur in fairy tales? I don't think that is necessary to reflect much on it. They are basically the same thing. Only that in alchemy, mostly materials are transformed. Lead is turned into gold, while in fairy tales, more often, foxes are turned into human beings and so on. But you have also, for the devil sometimes turns leaves into gold, and afterwards in the morning it's again leaves and so on. That would be purely alchemy. So, besides, there is a tremendous closeness between alchemy and folklore. There are many Grimm fairy tales who contain a lot of influence from alchemical writings, and there are a lot of alchemical writings which have incorporated fairy tale motifs. The same is true for Persian fairy tale, and the same is even more true for Chinese Taoistic tales. Sometimes there are Chinese Taoistic texts where you could say it is an alchemical text, or you can say it's a folk story. So they are very closely knitted together and had a constant cross-fertilization. Please share comments on the state of your present activities, interest, work in Zurich in this time. Please comment on your awareness about the state and function of psychiatry today, and perhaps speculate about the places of psychiatry and analysis as it should be. Kindly comment on residency training programs. Now, all that outer residency programs and training, I know nothing about it because they change the rules every half year, but you can simply write to the C.G. Jung Institute and you will get so much of red tape sent with all the regulations, costs, everything in it. They have it in multigraph, so it's much easier and will be much more accurate if you do that. What I do myself is that I analyze 6.5 months of the time I analyze, 1% patients, 1%, no, 1/3 patients, 1/3 student, 1/3 colleagues, I have figured out. And lecture a little bit at the Jung Institute and sometimes also at the School for Adult Education. And the other 5.5 months, though I have a negative mother complex, you see I have developed the laziness, I retire to the country, and there I do my writing and playing, and mainly also working on myself. That's all I can say about myself. Now, please comment on the state and function of psychiatry. I think psychiatry is, and at least for the time being, for a long time, will be different from what we are doing, because the situation in a clinic and the situation of being overcrowded by heavy cases, as psychiatrists are exposed to in a clinic, requires other means. If a psychiatrist would approach every patient as we do, with personal concern and going deeply into his personal problems, which naturally would be a good thing to do, but if he did that, he would die within 3 months. So out of sheer practical reasons, it is not possible. One has to use psychopharmaca to keep the people quiet. These are all honest psychiatrists know this is not therapy, this is self-defense and tricks to cope somehow with an impossible situation. And I don't see, with the overpopulation and the overflooding of asylums, how that will be for a long time change. But I think it will be useful if in time psychiatry will learn more about what we do in therapy, and then perhaps be able to pick out the more therapy-capable patients. First, to spot out the more therapy-capable patients among their patients, spot them out, and send them into therapy. They would be relieved of those cases, and secondly, those cases would be capable of therapy and could be, with good results, treated. They would still have enough of the other cases who are not so easily approachable for therapy. So I think it is a question of reasonable cooperation which should be built up. If you have not yet chosen fairy tale for tonight's gathering, would you please consider telling and exploring the handless maiden, girl with the silver hands, if you think it would be appropriate? Do the others agree? All right, let it be the handless maiden. Given the immense power of the unconscious, that the ego and consciousness is an emanation of the unconscious, can the ego catalyze, encounter, and change, in fact, direct change, or is the role of consciousness limited to recognition and observance of these demons within one? Is the encounter only something one is forced into? I would say no. I think, in spite of that, the ego is infinitesimally weak compared to the power of the unconscious, and its possibilities of actions are incredibly limited. The courageous stand in a powerless situation of an ego can transform the whole power of the unconscious. You see that clearest if you have read Answer to Job. The fact that Job was exposed to the rage of God. Now, think of the difference. A poor, silly, helpless old man, sick old man, and God being storming against him. And he had the wisdom to not argue with God, because he saw that this would have been impertinent. But inwardly, he stuck to his guns. Inwardly, he thought, I call God against God. God must be just. He clung to the wisdom of God against the dark side of God. He called God to help him against God, and, with what results? So you can say the ego is infinitely powerless and infinitely helpless, but if it heroically sticks to its ethics, it can have an infinite effect on more than we can presently even conceive. That it's already a theory. And it's simple, one has to be it. It's much too irrational that one could put it in a drawer, so to speak. It's something one simply feels. One feels to be a woman, or one feels to be a man. I mean, and there are, sometimes when you see very furry dogs, you can't look at their genitals, so you don't know if it's a male or a female, but look into a dog's eyes. You can always know if it's a feminine or a masculine. I never have made a mistake in my life. You can read it from the eyes. So there must be a difference. But I cannot verbalize it. You can perhaps, I cannot. You quoted Dr. Jung as saying in reply to your telling your dream, damn it. Would you care to comment? I've heard several interpretations. Oh, damn it. I translated it with damn it. What he said in Swiss dialect was Herrgott Sterne, Herrgott Sterne, Herrgott Sterne normal. And that is simply in Swiss dialect, God and stars. It's a kind of curse which you express when you are overwhelmed or amazed. Not negative. You say that when you are impressed. When you think something is wonderfully impressive, then you say, Herrgott Sterne noch einmal. So I mean, damn it, in the sense of wonder or amazement, or, ejaculation of amazement. How many languages did Jung and yourself know, read, and understand? And which ones are they? Also for yourself, which ones that you don't know do you feel would be useful yourself in the future? Jung spoke fluently French, English, German, a little bit of Italian to get around, but I don't think fluently, Latin and Greek, and then quite a bit of Swahili. Those, I think, were the languages he knew. I know German, French, English, a little bit of get around Italian, Latin, and Greek, and that is all. And I have once begun Arabic, but have stuck, and this is still a kind of unhappy love in me. If I had more time and energy, I would go back to learning Arabic, because I love Ibn Sina, I love Al-Ghazali, and I also would be able to follow up the whole alchemical tradition, not know the Greek text, then use Arabic translations, and then go back to Latin texts of the Middle Ages. I would be able, in this intermediary stage to read the text. That would be. And the plan, what I think I really will do, Arabic I think is an unhappy love, which will never come out. But I am working on improving my Italian. I have 2 Italian analysants who tell me their problems and dreams in Italian, and I do understand it, but I haven't yet the courage to answer in Italian. So they talk Italian and I answer in French. In a study concerning typology reported in the Journal of Analytical Psychology, a very large group of California analysts were strongly of the thinking, feeling, intuitive type. Not necessarily in that order, but those 3 types. Do most Jungians fall into this classification? And if so, are we as a group lopsided and limited because of our undifferentiated sensation function? It can happen that by chance, some types, too many types in a group come together. Not necessarily those, it can be others. I know groups where thinking is prevailing too much, and then they become academic discussions all the time and no relatedness. So that is a chance thing. I think the fact that relatively many feeling intuitive types have in the past gone into Jungian psychology is because it was in America 30 years ago culturally disapproved of. Culturally, you had to be on-the-spot business, success, mind, and sensation. And the cultural canon rather rejected feeling and intuition behavior. So we are always the undercurrent. So with us assembled mostly intuitive and feeling. But now that, let's say, in the youth culture, intuition and feeling is very much tops. It might be the other way around, that we would now get also misunderstood sensation types flowing to us. So that fluctuates, to my opinion, in generally we are the trash can for that what is culturally rejected. And that is a very nice position. I'd never wanted to change. Is the typology classification useful for working with children? I think children are much more whole and not yet so lopsidedly developed into main functions. But you see already in a child of 4, 5, 6, the beginning of a thinking type or being more a feeling type. So it's quite useful to know about it. And perhaps I would say even to not encourage the lopsidedness, but rather encourage that the balance is maintained. Concerning myth, would you discuss Jung's comparative approach to mythology? Does not the procedure of going across many mythologies in order to image similarities result in the loss of the situatedness of mythic themes? Is not this procedure of Jung a rhetorical device that Jung employs to convince others of his insights? Does not this procedure finally etherealize archetypes to the point where the critical meaning of the word first model is lost? Does not psychology, at least Western psychology, need the language of Greek mythology for its themes? Any attempt to go beyond this classic tradition makes psychology into pseudo-spirituality. Is there not enough diversity in Greek mythology? I think some of this question has been already touched upon by Dr. Hillman this morning. If you treat archetypes in this wrong way of saying it means treating them as a kind of intellectual allegory of which you can replace by an intellectual concept, then naturally this is all wrong. But otherwise, you see, we have no choice in our actual work. This question, Greek mythology, I have to treat with the archetype which is constellated in my patient. And I have to know that mythology which is constellated in my patient's dreams. And if his unconscious chooses to dream Greek mythology, I have to know Greek mythology. But if I'm, as I lately did, analyze an Aztec Mexican and he dreams that he's persecuted by an obsidian stone, then I have to call in Tezcatlipoca, who is, as you all know, represented by the obsidian stone. So it is the individual you analyze who situates the mythology. And if you have, Jung has published an interesting case of a woman who was not Indian, but who grew up in India in the first years of her life, and he couldn't understand her dreams till he saw that it was all tantric symbolism. So practically, we have to deal with the myth which we encounter. It's a living encounter. The myth lives in the people. And you have to translate them. This Mexican was an interesting experience because in Mexico there seems to be still a lot of racial prejudices, and he projected them onto us, and so he hid, when he came to Zurich, he hid that he was an Aztec and pretended he was a Spanish Mexican. And his first analyst failed with him completely, and he failed all the exams we had. And finally the general decision was that he was very nice but extremely stupid. And then he came to me, and I first had the same impression. Whatever I did or said about his dreams, he made and then he told the next dream. And I said, does it make sense? Or can you not respond? Can you not tell me? Does it make sense what I'm telling you? Or do you feel this is right? Yeah. I always sat there and I thought, now, somebody's stupid. Either he's stupid or I am stupid. But one of the two is stupid. I don't know. It doesn't work. And then he had a dream that an obsidian stone was in a tree, and suddenly jumped down the tree and rolled after him, and he ran for his life. He knew it was highest danger, and then there were laborers, and they had dug out a square in the earth, and they showed him to quickly go into it, so he stood into it and stood still. And there the obsidian stone became smaller and smaller, and then peacefully rolled and settled before his feet. And then I said, now, God damn, what have you to do with Tezcatlipoca? And then he broke down and said, oh, I'm an Aztec. And from then on, everything went, because then I knew his language. Then I talked to him as much as I knew from Aztec mythology in his language. And I knew that the Aztecs think with the heart, and that you mustn't put anything conceptualized. So I spoke only in feeling terms. And then he was all right. Then we suddenly had a complete and absolutely normal human communication. But what would I have done with Greek mythology? A few years ago, when I was just reading Jung's paper on synchronicity, I suddenly had a quick intuitive message that came up in a dream. In a dreamlike drifting state, not at the time when I was consciously thinking about synchronicity. An inner voice simply said, synchronicity is a recognition of the archetype working in time. This statement has always seemed right, yet it remains fairly opaque to me. I have discussed it only briefly, never in analysis, and wonder if you can get more insight into it. Would you comment on it? I would simply say, that makes complete sense to me. I would only add, synchronicity is a recognition of the archetype working in space-time. Because as you know, in modern physics, you cannot separate space and time. So I would put space-time in. But that is it. That's what Jung calls the transgressive aspect of the archetype, that the archetype which we think of as a mainly unconscious psychic structure can appear in outer space-time material form, manifest itself in outer space-time material form. That is what a synchronistic event is. It's just that it seems still dark to you. I cannot dispel that darkness, because synchronicity is an infinite darkness to all of us. Jung said, when he finished his paper on synchronicity, he said, now I bumped my head against the ceiling. I feel I just can't go further. There's infinitely more there, but I've come to a limit. I can't go further for the moment. He has then, in a letter to a Mr. Smithies, a parapsychologist, he has written a bit further, but about that he thinks that the psyche is an unextended intensity. As if you would think that this intensity would speed up, transcend light speed, and then become an unextended intensity which, he calls it, irrealizes the bodies, and that our brain is a station where this high intensity is tuned down onto, so that we perceive things in in the time-space continuum as material bodies, which is, as we all know, a kind of illusion. It's due to our structure that we see it that way. But then he says, but I think nobody can follow me there, so I'm restricting myself to only explaining synchronicity. But if you want to dig deeper, I would recommend you that letter. To me, it gave me some insight. Do you feel the way Teilhard du Chardin expresses his experiences is so to speak, on the same way as Jung? If so, how? It has always seemed to me that Teilhard sees multiple presences in everything, of growth and vitality in everything. Jung once said to Serrano, it's reported in the Serrano book, that Teilhard du Chardin is a great book. I have never spoken to him about it. So my own impression is that there is quite a partial overlapping or coming together of Jungian ideas and Teilhard du Chardin in the concept of evolution. But Teilhard du Chardin is bound through tradition to his ideas of entelechy, which is an Aristotelian concept, and which in a way does not quite cover the concept of the self. Though the self, the Jungian self, has very much to do with an entelechy. And also, Teilhard du Chardin's philosophical outlook is very optimistic, and Jung was not so optimistic. As you know from his memoirs, he says at the end, both is true. The universe is of immense meaninglessness and of deep meaning. I harbor the anxious hope that meaning will prevail. So you see how much more careful he formulated the idea. He thought it was possible that the dark side and the destructive forces could any minute still throw over all the evolutionary process which has happened on this planet up till now, that this is quite conceivable. In that way, he was much more, he hoped for the best, but he was not so sure as that it would end up in this way. And that, I think there is an advantage in this pessimism. It's not pessimism because he still hopes, but not in that certainty of Teilhard. Namely, it puts more responsibility on us. It depends on every one of us how it goes. We cannot hope that it'll anyhow come right. Yesterday you spoke of the synchronistic pattern, the I Ching, and the genetic code. Your personal one about the aqua vitae, your personal dream about the aqua vitae. Thirdly, precognitive dream synchronous with impersonal events, i.e. death of someone not closely involved in one's personal sphere. Would you reflect and make discriminations among synchronistic couplings, collective, impersonal, personal? I haven't done that. I just don't know. To my idea, synchronistic events are always transpersonal. I haven't seen ones which have only a meaning for the one human being. They are because that is already implied in the fact that they happen when an archetype is in an excited state. When an archetype is constellated, or the physicist would say in an excited state, then only synchronistic event happen. And an archetype is already a transpersonal or interpersonal phenomenon. Is not, when an archetype is constellated in human being, the whole surrounding is always deeply affected. So personal, I would say, is out. Collective and impersonal, I would say, is always involved. What do you think of the numbers in Lilly's Center of the Cyclone? I haven't read that book. Somebody told me about it, but I cannot comment. I think that's a sign, as I'm coughing, that we stop. I have only a few left, and we can do them with the floor ones afterwards. What time do you have? 5
4? Since it is 5 after 4, and so we are running a little late, I'm wondering whether you want to continue after the break for a while, or whether you want to go ahead and move. What we can do is move the experimental day things perhaps to tomorrow, if you would like to continue with Dr. von Franz for a while.
Synchronicity and the work of the devil. Could the former explain away the latter? No. I think they are. Negative synchronicity exists, and the work of the devil is just it. It's the right word for it. You see that most tragically in schizophrenic outbreaks, when people are on the way downhill into a psychotic episode. That is a time where very often a lot of synchronistic events happen, and generally in that state of mind, because they are gliding into the deep unconscious, schizophrenics listen to synchronistic events and take them as religious signs of encouragement. I think of a case now who listened to the hooting of the cars outside her hotel, and whenever she had a thought, it did boop, then she knew the thought was right. And when there was a creak in the central heating, then the thought was wrong. And she got right mad till she had to be interned. I mean, and she wrote and wrote at the last stages till she passed out and couldn't read anymore. And she made all the hoot and peep into it. And they were all to her signs of God, you know, not to do this or do this. And it was all devilish. It was work of the devil is a pictorial, good description of it. In other words, those synchronicities chased her right into madness. So I would certainly say there is such a thing as negative synchronicity, just as there is such a thing as devil or devils. I can link that up perhaps with the other question. Somebody says, is the unconscious always right? And I would say, oh no. The unconscious is both, is demonic, is healing and destroying, is demonic and healing, is constructive and creative and utterly destructive. But we are the decisive factor. As Jung puts it so well, he says the unconscious shows us the face which we show it. And therefore, if we are negative to the unconscious, which is generally the case, or at least in the cases I have seen of outbreak of schizophrenia, the people were negatively tuned towards the unconscious because they were carried away by certain personal power or sex or other desires and wouldn't listen anymore to the inner voice. They were carried away by one drive. And then everything becomes negative. Then the influence of the unconscious becomes negative. And then even helps to pave the way to hell by negative synchronicities. And therefore, it is so tremendously important that one is not credulously just believing in the unconscious, but that one has to have a real confrontation with anything which comes from the unconscious. And that it all depends on our interpretation.